The United States Army North is a formation of the United States Army Service Component Command of United States Northern Command, is the Joint Force Land Component Command. It is responsible for homeland defense and defense support of civil authorities. It is garrisoned at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, from early January 1943, when it was first created during World War II under the command of Lieutenant General Mark Wayne Clark, until 2004. It was previously designated as the United States Fifth Army. History: World War II. The United States Fifth Army was one of the principal formations of the U.S. Army in the Mediterranean during World War II, and was the first American field army ever to be activated outside of the United States. It was officially activated on 5 January 1943 at Oujda, French Morocco, and made responsible for the defense of Algeria and Morocco. It was also given the responsibility for planning the American part of the invasion of mainland Italy, and therefore was not involved in the Allied invasion of Sicily, where it was instead assigned the role of training combat troops destined for Sicily. The United States Fifth Army was initially commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Wayne Clark, who would lead the Fifth Army for nearly 2 years, and was to experience some of the toughest fighting of World War II, where it was engaged on the Italian front, which was, in many ways, often more reminiscent of the trench warfare of the Western Front in World War I. Writing to Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers in late March 1944, Clark explained the difficulties of the fighting in Italy so far, which could be said of the whole campaign. They were, he claimed, terrain, weather, carefully prepared defensive positions in the mountains, determined and well-trained enemy troops, grossly inadequate means at our disposal while on the offensive, with approximately equal forces to the defender. The Fifth Army first saw action during Salerno landings, the assault landings at Salerno, part of the Allied invasion of Italy, in September 1943. Due to the comparatively low numbers of American troops available in the Mediterranean theater, it was made up of 1 American and 1 British corps. They were the U.S. 6th Corps, under Major General Ernest J. Dawley, and the British 10th Corps, under Lieutenant General Richard L. McCreary. At Salerno, 6th Corps landed on the right flank, and 10th Corps on the left flank. Progress was initially slow, due in part to a lack of initiative by Dawley, the 6th Corps commander, and due also to heavier-than-expected German resistance. However, heavy naval and air bombardment, along with a parachute drop by elements of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, had saved the forces from any danger of being driven back into the sea. Combined with the approach of the British 8th Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, the German 10th Army began to retreat. On the 20th of September, by which time the 5th and 8th Armies had linked up, Major General Dawley, 6th Corps commander, was relieved of his command by Clark. Dawley was temporarily made Deputy Army Commander, and was soon replaced in command of 6th Corps by Major General John P. Lucas. Progress was then good for a couple of weeks, and the Fifth Army crossed the Barbara Line and the Volturno Line until the Germans stood and fought. They had established a position on the Winter Line, which included the formidable defensive positions at San Pietro Infine in the Liri Valley and at Monte Cassino. By this point, Fifth Army had been reinforced by a 2nd American Corps, 2nd Corps, commanded by Major General Jeffrey Keyes. By the end of November, Clark's Fifth Army had almost doubled in size, with the addition of French General Alphonse Juin's French Expeditionary Corps, from 130,247 men to 243,827. With the failure of the first operations to capture Monte Cassino, an attempt was made to exploit the Allied preponderance in sea power before the coming invasion of Normandy robbed the Mediterranean of the naval forces necessary for an amphibious assault to seize Rome. 6th Corps, with its experience of amphibious landings at Salerno, was chosen for the assault and withdrawn from the line, replaced by the French Expeditionary Corps. They made a second attempt to capture Monte Cassino in conjunction with the amphibious assault by 6th Corps, which again failed. 6th Corps landed at Anzio, unopposed, on the 22nd of January 1944 in Operation Shingle, and suffered many of the same problems as had been seen at Salerno. A perceived lack of initiative on the part of the commander, Major General Lucas, combined with worries about the Germans catching 6th Corps off balance if it advanced too far inland, resulted in the beachhead being bottled up. The Germans launched a series of attacks and counterattacks, with both sides sustaining heavy losses, and nearly breached the last beachhead defenses before again being driven off by heavy naval and air support. The fault, however, was not due to Lucas's incompetence. It was due instead to wishful thinking, faulty operational planning, and the German army's ability to respond forcefully and aggressively. After the failure of Shingle, a large reorganization took place. Previously, the Apennines had been the rough dividing line between 5th and 8th Armies. However, the dividing line was shifted westwards, to allow the concentration of both armies on the western side of Italy for maximum firepower to break through to Rome. British 5th Corps was left on the Adriatic coast to pin down any German units there. 5th Army was relieved of responsibility for Cassino, and the final phases of that battle saw Indian, New Zealand and finally Polish troops thrown against the fortress. 5th Army also lost McCreary's British 10th Corps at this time, since it was felt that having exclusively American organized units under 5th Army and British organized units under 8th Army would ease logistics. The breakthrough was achieved during the spring of 1944. Coordinated assaults by all the Allied forces, except 5th Corps, which was confined to a holding action, broke through. 2nd Corps attacked along the coast. The French Expeditionary Corps, in a classic demonstration of mountain warfare, broke through on the right flank of 5th Army, and 6th Corps, now commanded by Major General Lucien K. Truscott, broke out of the Anzio beachhead. By early summer, Allied forces were well on the way to capturing Rome. At this point, one of the more controversial incidents in the history of 5th Army occurred. The strategic conception of General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied armies in Italy, was that the forces of 6th Corps, coming out of Anzio, would trap the retreating German forces, and leave them to be annihilated by the advancing 5th and 8th Armies. However, in contravention of orders, Clark diverted units of 6th Corps towards Rome, leaving a small blocking force to attempt to stop the Germans. It failed to do so, and the German forces were able to escape and re-establish a coherent line to the north of Rome. Clark claimed that there were significant German threats which necessitated the diversion, but many believe that he was primarily glory-seeking by being the first to liberate Rome. 2 days after Rome fell, on the 4th of June 1944, Operation Overlord was launched. The strategic conception of Overlord called for a supporting operation to be mounted by invading southern France. In order to do so, forces would have to be withdrawn from the Allied armies in Italy. In the end, 6th Corps was withdrawn, forming the nucleus of the field forces of the U.S. 7th Army for the invasion of the French Riviera, Operation Dragoon. The French Expeditionary Corps was also withdrawn, to allow allow its men to be used for the French First Army, a follow-up formation for Dragoon. In slightly less than 2 months, the strength of the Fifth Army dropped from 248,989 down to 153,323. However, the 25,000-strong Brazilian Expeditionary Force under Marshal J.B. Mascarenhas de Morales, as well as other divisions, had arrived to align with U.S. 4th Corps under Major General Willis D. Krittenberger. So 2 corps were maintained within 5th Army. In the second half of 1944, the Allied forces fighting on the Italian front within the U.S. 5th Army and British 8th Army resembled more a multinational force being constituted by Americans, British, French, members of French and British colonies, as well as Brazilians and exiled forces from Poland, Greece, former Czechoslovakia and anti-fascist Italians. The Germans re-established the line across Italy at the level of Pisa and Rimini. The Allied forces spent another winter after fierce fighting in the summer and autumn in front of the Gothic line, frustrated at the lack of ability to break through. This time Fifth Army, with British 13th Corps under command, led by Lieutenant General Sidney Kirkman, was straddling the Apennines, with many of its units occupying high, exposed positions which were miserable to garrison. That winter also saw a significant change of command. Lieutenant General Clark moved to command 15th Army Group, and Lieutenant General Lucien K. Truscott was appointed to command 5th Army in his place. Truscott would command the army from the 16th of December 1944 until the war's end. Another change came in January 1945 when 13th Corps reverted to control of British 8th Army, which had also seen many changes in composition and command, and was now commanded by Lieutenant General Richard L. McCreary. In the final offensive of the Italian campaign, launched in April 1945 against the German Army Group C, the 8th Army initiated the main offensive on the Adriatic coast, and then the 5th Army also broke through the German defences around Bologna. The German units, in the main, were pinned against the Po River and destroyed, or at the very least deprived of the transport and heavy weapons, which effectively made many of them useless. 2nd Corps units raced through Milan towards the French frontier and the great port of Genoa. 4th Corps pushed due north through Verona, Vicenza and as far as Bolzano and to the Brenner Pass, where they linked up with elements of the U.S. 7th Army under Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. Its role in Italy cost 5th Army dearly. It suffered 109,642 casualties in 602 days of combat, of which 19,475 were killed in action. The 5th Army headquarters returned to the United States in September 1945. 5th Army was deactivated on 2 October 1945 at Camp Miles Standish, Massachusetts, in the informal athletic competitions held between units of the European and North African theaters. The 5th Army was among the most successful, winning titles in baseball, boxing, swimming, and football during the 1944 season. The football championship was gained after a victory over 12th Air Force in the Spaghetti Bowl on January 1, 1945. United States 5th Army, U.S. 2nd Corps, U.S. 34th Infantry Division, U.S. 88th Infantry Division, U.S. 91st Infantry Division, U.S. 4th Corps 6th South African Armored Division, U.S. 85th Infantry Division, Brazilian Expeditionary Force, U.S. 442nd Infantry Regiment, British 13th Corps, British 1st Infantry Division, British 6th Armored Division, 8th Indian Infantry Division, Army Group Reserve, U.S. 1st Armored Division. Post-war, the Army's next role was considerably less violent, and it was reactivated on the 11th of June 1946 at Chicago under the command of Major General John P. Lucas, who had commanded U.S. 6th Corps in the early stages of the Battle of Anzio during World War II before being relieved. It was redesignated as the 5th United States Army on the 1st of January 1957. Its post-war role was as a command and control headquarters for U.S. Army Reserve units, formerly responsible for the training of many Army troops and also the ground defense of part of the continental United States. In June 1971, the 5th Army moved to its current base at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. In 2004, 5th Army transferred its reserve preparation obligations to 1st Army, and became responsible for homeland defense and defense support of civil authorities as United States Army North. The Army Service Component Command of United States Northern Command, Joint Task Force Civil Support, U.S. Subordinate Command, is designated as the Department of Defense Command element for Department of Defense assistance to the overall federal response to a state government's request for assistance in the event of a catastrophic chemical, biological, nuclear or high-yield explosive CBRNE emergency. The command also has a subordinate contingency command post, known as Task Force 51, which is responsible for responding to all hazards incidents that require assistance. TF-51 can be employed as an all-hazards task force or a joint task force with joint augmentation. Structure and organization of the 5th Army Command Group. Commanding General Lieutenant General Perry L. Wiggins. Deputy Commanding General Operations Major General James R. Blackburn, Jr. Deputy to the Commanding General Mr. Robert Neathing. Deputy Commanding General Reserve Affairs Brigadier General Peter Boss. Command Sergeant Major Ronald Orris. Bibliography. Ready, J. Lee, Forgotten Allies. The European Theatre, Volume 1. McFarland and Amp Company, 1985. ISBN 9780899501291. Ready, J. Lee, Forgotten Allies. The military contribution of the colonies, exiled governments and lesser powers to the Allied victory in World War II. McFarland and Amp Company, 1985. ISBN 9780899501178. John B. Mikolschek. General Mark Clark, commander of America's 5th Army in World War II and liberator of Rome.